welcome to the Florida Public Archaeology Network's virtual Cafecito lecture. This is a virtual program we started last September trying to make more accessible stories and works of people that highlight the Latinx heritage and history here in Florida. And we are very, very grateful and honored to have David join us. David Rahahę Webb is a multifaceted educator, historian, and environmental scientist with over 2 decades of experience in nonprofit and educational leadership. Currently, he is the executive director of Muddy Sneakers Outdoor Classroom in North Carolina. And David belongs to the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina. His culture has shaped his worldview and is central to his life. And he is also a traditional and contemporary Native American artist and an active community member. David is also a direct descendant of the Spanish Seminoles or Spanish Indians living at the Sanibel Island rancho. His family included the first documented births on the island and in southern Florida. And he recently authored the book, The Spanish Seminole, The Untold History of the Spanish Indians as Shared by a Descendant, which he will discuss today with us. And, he will be presenting a detailed account of the Spanish Indians, their history, using newly uncovered documents, primary sources, and oral histories, adding to our understanding of the ranchos. Thank you so much, David, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Nat. Muchas gracias. So I'll introduce myself first in the Tuscarora language. Chwent Nagayas Kisiana, David Gyalset, Uchat Rahahę di Oxenahe Wawe, Skarure di Wagat Snoopne, Disne Squarine Kisasat, Disne Raleigh Waknene. So I just shared a personal introduction in the Tuscarora language, also saying that I live in Raleigh and I belong to the Wolf Clan of the Tuscarora Nation. This journey in writing this book was unintentional to begin with. I like to explore family history, and I just happened to be reading a little bit about one of my ancestors that I knew was of Cuban descent, and that was all I knew about him. He moved to Florida according to family tradition and settled with his brother and had a cattle ranch. And my grandfather's actually on this talk tonight. So welcome to my granddad, Lamar or Marty. And he's super excited about this book. So I'm glad you could be here for the talk. But the actual history of what I uncovered was pretty exceptional. I grew up on Sanibel Island and always heard about the Spanish Indians as they were popularly known. They were really an enigmatic, mysterious group that lived on the island and through the barrier islands of Southwest Florida. And a lot of people, archaeologists, historians, residents, old timers, they always would guess at what their lineage was. Were they Calusa, the tribe that culturally, politically disappeared from the area? Were they Seminole or Miccosukee or some other group? And so that was always something that was taught as I came up through environmental education and history in the area, and was a big source of mystery and something people were really curious about. So I was really interested when the history that I'm going to share with you today. So I'll talk a little bit about the methodologies for this. First off, using Indigenous research methodologies as an Indigenous person myself, it's important that we listen to Indigenous voices, memories, stories, oral history, and really kind of decolonize the framework around it. So if you've read already, or you do read my book, you'll notice a lot of the language that I use in there. I try to be as accurate as possible in portraying the names of people and places in their original language with as close a meaning as I could. I talked to friends that are members of the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, and friends that are out in the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, who helped me with some of the translations and other aspects of language, and even family stories from their families that I included in this work. And also using traditional research methodologies. I am a trained scientist, and I work in the field as a scientist and environmental educator, actually, specifically. And so I see the value in Western minds of having proper citations and citing that information. So that's all included in this work. A little bit about my family. I am Tuscarora. My father is also Meherrin, as well as Tuscarora, and my mother's also PD. And as you'll see here, my mother and her side of the family, my grandfather's side, are descendants of the Spanish Seminole or the Spanish Indians who lived on Sanibel Island. And so my family goes way back on Sanibel Island, obviously, to prehistory. And growing up there, we always had a lot of pride in being from the island. One of the few families and one of the oldest families on the island, and actually the oldest is as you'll see. But here we've got some photos of myself with my father, nephew, and my niece from a few years ago on at a ceremonial event. And one of my great grandmothers here, great great grandmothers, my great grandfather Jake, who lived on Sanibel really all his life. And my grandmother, who was not a Seminole descendant, but very special because Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge admin building was actually named for her. She worked there for very much her life. And my great grandfather, who's pictured here, was their first employee at Ding Darling. So my mother, who's in the bottom corner picture with me as a baby, and my dad also worked at the wildlife refuge, as did I. So you can imagine 4 generations of us working at the refuge, and that really inspiring me to go into the environmental field. So I've worked a lot with marine science. I've managed the sea turtle program for Miami-Dade County and other wildlife monitoring programs, and also being very active. My culture being really central in my life and important to me. You can see some of my artwork here and friends, relatives. But these are some old family pictures. These are actual Spanish Indian or Spanish Seminole descendants in these pictures. So a couple more pictures of Jake here. And then we have Jake's great grandmother and her sister. So they were Azel and Josie Montes de Oca. So they were our ancestors as well. And then you have some other Montes de Oca family members in the photos. So all of these pictures are Montes de Ocas, and also my great grandfather, whose mother was a Montes de Oca. And then here, this is not a family member, but I thought this was a really good picture of how fishing worked in the barrier islands. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it was a very close to the earth kind of life. The people lived off the land and the water. This is actually a 6,000-year-old culture that started with the ancestors of the Calusa 6,000 years ago and was passed down. And we know that through archaeological evidence, such as net making tools and actual nets themselves and the methods that were used in terms of catching these fish that was used from 6,000 years ago up until, my grandfather, who's on this call, was a commercial fisherman years back. And this was the type of work that was done. My grandfather shared an oral history that's at the end of my book, the last chapter, where he talks about what it was like even before motorboats while they did this type of lifestyle. So I'd like to hopefully see people change the typical name of Spanish Indians to be more correct to Spanish Seminole. And this is really important, I think, because it just kind of gets to the point of dispelling all the mysteries around the people. At the time, every native person in Florida broadly was referred to by outsiders as Seminole, including the Spanish, who at the time that happened laid claim to the state of Florida or to the peninsula of Florida. And so even in these old baptism records in Cuba that we'll talk about, where one of some of our family members were baptized, brought down to Cuba as Seminole children and baptized down there, they actually documented some of them as cimarrones, which comes from a Taino word from Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic that then was Hispanized into cimarrones, that then became Cimalones and Seminole in the Muskogee language, Seminole, and then that ended up being anglicized into Seminole. So that word has undergone 4 or 5 different iterations or folk etymologies. So something really important about this is also dispelling the myth that the ranchos were all made up of Cuban fishermen. That is not true. My ancestor and his family were really the only Cubans or people of Cuban ancestry that were in the ranchos, as according to the baptism records. I'm sure there were others that were there, but certainly was not the majority. They were Seminole people. The majority were Seminole people who were working with the Hispanic Latino fishermen from all over colonized Americas. So they were based out of Regla, Cuba. So that's right across the bay in Havana, across the bay from Havana. And I think that's the source of confusion, because at the time, Florida was really seen as Cuba North. So Cuba was really the center. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. And what were their origins? So something that I think is important, that is a huge tragedy in history in Florida, is people think that the ancestors of the Seminole and Miccosukee people came into Florida and replaced the indigenous people of Florida. You know, the Tocobaga and the Tequesta and the Calusa and Ais. That's not the case. There was, of course, the Indian slave trade, which was the majority of South Carolina's whole economy, and a lot of those natives came from Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas, including our own ancestors from the Tuscarora Nation. But also the tribes that went down there, for instance, a lot of the Miccosukee people were not part of that slave trade. And when they came down into the peninsula from the Panhandle, where they were already living, and they were already spending time down in the peninsula for time immemorial, they merged and they incorporated these other groups. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Actually, I'll just mention it here quickly. The Tacoshafle people, or one of the clans within the Seminole tribe of Florida, and the Miccosukee people. There's an oral history that I share in my book from Jimmy Billy that actually talks about when the ancestors of the Miccosukee came down into the peninsula, down into the Everglades area, Southwest Florida, and they came across these people that did not speak their language, Ilapongi, the Miccosukee language. They didn't speak that language. So they encountered them, and they were able to interpret and figure out that they wanted to be adopted into the bigger group of people of the Miccosukee. And they held council, and they decided to bring them in, but they actually made up their own clan. So most of the other clans from Muskogee people are made up straight out of their creation story. You have birds and panther and wind and snake and alligator and otter. And Tacoshafle is different because it doesn't really have a translation. According to Jimmy Billy, they heard them say like talk, talk, talk. That's what their language sounded like to them. And so they called them Tacoshafle, which just means taco shaf people, taco people, based on the sounds that they heard. So looking at Florida history, and really all of our history here on Turtle Island, which is what my own people call North America, Turtle Island. When you look at this history, if we look at a 24-hour clock, this is not a 12-hour clock, 24 hours. So one full day from 12 a.m. one day until 11:59 at the end of that day, middle of the night. So indigenous presence in the peninsula of Florida is at least 14,000 years ago. We like to say we've been here forever. And that's important to us. But when you try to conceptualize time from an indigenous perspective, it does not translate to a Western or a colonized mindset. So I think a lot of settler descendants, including myself, I'm mixed, but a lot of settler descendants like to put time frames on how long indigenous people were here. There's really no comparison, as you can see from this clock. I think that's a kind of a way that settler people of a settler mindset make themselves feel a little better about, being a few generations or maybe 5 generations from being born in the Americas. But really, when you look at this going back tens of thousands of years, the Calusa fishing culture started down here at about 1:43 p.m., a little bit more than halfway through this clock. And that was 6,000 years ago. And then if we go all the way ahead to when the Spanish first arrived in Florida, that was about 11:09 p.m. So indigenous people existed here for that entire day. And in the very last hour of that day, Europeans arrived on the continent. And that's so small compared to our measurement of time immemorial, which includes at least 420,000 generations in Florida and 1.5 million generations in North America. So just looking at the history of Florida, many of us are familiar with this. 1513 with Juan Ponce de Leon arriving in Florida. The Calusa actually shot him with a poison dart, and he died soon thereafter. But the Catholics tried to establish a mission among the Calusa early on, and they were expelled. And then by 1760, after disease and enslavement, the slave trade that was really fed by the British, the Calusa really disappeared as a political entity, but their descendants remained and were incorporated into Seminole and Miccosukee people. And that's a whole other discussion, the distinction between Seminole and Miccosukee people of today. But really, Florida, as I said, was Cuba North. So this is a photo I took from El Morro, the port right here at the entrance to Havana Bay. So you can see actual downtown Havana across the pass here at the bay. And this is the top of the fort, which really guarded Havana as the hub for all of Hispanic Latin America, all of what Spain claimed. So this was really the sort of the hub of that wheel, including Florida, which at the time extended all the way up to Virginia, as far as the Spanish were concerned. And our timeline continues. In the 1600s, the fishermen out of Cuba that we talked about started working with the Calusa. And the Calusa certainly remained and continued to work with them as the terms that I use in the book, which is Yatgadishi, that's the Miccosukee term, just meaning Indian people or the people, and then Istijati in Creek or the Muskogee language. They both just mean like red person is the literal translation for both languages. So the British were in South Carolina, they were engaged in that slave trade, and the Miccosukee in Southwest Florida had come down and they established themselves there along with some other camps from the Muskogee different Creek groups and towns that moved down. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book in terms of the matrilineal nature of indigenous people in the East, and how all of these families that were moving down, they relocated with their entire towns and their fires from their towns they carried down into Florida. And the children that were even born with perhaps Hispanic or Latino fathers were still considered to be members of that tribe and identified as such. And the book, I provide a lot of evidence for that. Then we had the British period, which is quite complex, going back and forth, Florida being passed from one imperial colonial power to the other, including the United States. And that's all explained in there as well in terms of what that looked like. But the ranchos, they had this fishing industry that was quite prolific, and they continued to operate throughout this entire time until the Americans came in. And really the United States, a lot of fishermen from New England came down and wanted the business. They saw that there were literally tons of fish being traded from the natives that were capturing them and brought down to Cuba. So here you can see the general migration. On this map are some of the towns that are mentioned in the baptism records. So this is actually the translation of this is the towns from the book where the baptisms were recorded, which was the baptisms of Indians and of Nuestra Señora de la Regla, which has a whole other history to it. We'll talk about a little bit here. So we have down here the islands. Tio Cespa was actually Usepa Island, if you're familiar. And there were Chata people recorded that may have been Choctaw. people as well that were down in the area. And in the ranchos themselves in Southwest Florida, we have the barrier islands, and the Sanibel Rancho was located in Tarpon Bay, which was documented in the 1800s when the Americans first started coming into the area. So some of the statistics, the Spanish Seminole numbered about 600 at any given time, and at first the fisheries were seasonal. So the fishermen would come up, especially around this time of year during Lent, when in Cuba they were eating primarily fish. And all of the fish for Cuba and all of the enslaved peoples in Cuba were supplied out of Southwest Florida, out of these ranchos that the Spanish Seminole people were catching the fish and supplying them for important commodities and trade goods. And about 20% of the population can be identified, and that's through the baptism records and early U.S. censuses. And I even went through records I could find of ship logs, and also in others' research, like Dr. John Worth, some of the logs of ships of people that were carried down to Cuba. And a lot of the people that are listed in the baptisms were on those boats being brought down. We'll talk about that a little bit. But this was really economically important. So you may be familiar with the deerskin trade that nearly wiped out the white-tailed deer in the Southeast, the fur trade around the Great Lakes. These were important parts of this synergy between indigenous people and the newcomers, the colonists. They were making money here, and they were making it off of the labor and work and the wildlife of these lands. And so a lot of people think of the deerskin trade and the fur trade as being very significant to history. But something that I'd like to propose is that this fishing industry down here in the ranchos was just as significant and played a similar role culturally for those Spanish Seminole people that were involved in it, as it did to the other tribes up north. So looking at their identities in the ranchos, they retained their identities. So they spoke their languages. They required translators when they went down to Cuba for baptism. The translators were documented. Several other examples of the languages being spoken there are presented in my research. And Juan Montes de Oca, my own ancestor, he worked as a translator his whole life. He spoke Ilapongi, the Miccosukee language, and Muskoki, the Creek language, Seminole, the main body of Seminole language. And he worked, throughout his life as a translator, even for the Americans when they came. So they remained really fluid with what I call the mainland bands. And at one point, the Spanish Indians were documented as being one of 4 bands of Seminole people in Southwest Florida, but they were entirely fluid, and that research is included as well. And we know that they maintain their affiliations with their towns because in the baptism records, they say they came from these towns like Choconixtla. And they were not Christianized, which is really interesting because the Spaniards, or the Hispanic Latino people, men, they were the only Hispanic Latino people in the ranchos were men. So if they married women in the ranchos, they were indigenous women. There were no European women or women of European descent unless they were from those mixtures from that in the ranchos. They maintained this affiliation, and when they went down for their baptisms, they would often say that, well, the mother or the father, if the father was indigenous, wanted them to be baptized, but they themselves were not Christian. And their marriages were somehow considered legitimate in the Catholic Church, even though they were not married by a priest. There were no churches, there were no priests in the ranchos at all. So something else that I found in my research is creolization, or mixing of cultures and peoples, really didn't occur very much. The only pots and pans and commodities and such really, I don't think, qualifies as full creolization. So language, they were still speaking their indigenous languages, and most people did not speak Spanish. So, and there was no sort of Creole language being developed there. and a combination between the two, or some sort of pidgin tongue. That wasn't happening as far as we know. And the Spanish Indians were supplying arms and ammunition to the Seminole resistance. So you'll see in a couple minutes that really did not make the Americans happy. And so some of them also participated. There were a number of Spanish Seminole who fought. For instance, the Battle of Calusa, where Chikeka Chobi, or just Chikeka, who was known as a very tall, giant man, you know how myth goes around people, that he fought, led a whole band of Spanish Seminole men in this battle when they attacked the Americans during the Seminole War. And his name, he also went by, was Antonio Miqueca, which is an interesting name as well. So now talking a little bit about those baptisms that I referred to. This is one record of one of my own family members' my ancestor's family. But here you can see El Morro from the bay. I had that other photo of El Morro. I did not take this photo, but I thought it was really cool because this specific type of boat here is the type of boat that would carry people from Southwest Florida and the Keys and Tampa Bay, and up in the Panhandle all the way down to Cuba for these baptisms. This is the actual church. This is the Virgin Mary of Regla, and she is presented as a woman of color. The story of this virgin, her emanation, actually originated in West Africa, among Creolized people in West Africa. And she was brought to Cuba, and this church was built and named for her. This is a beautiful, beautiful spot. Regla is kind of a spot, interesting place to visit. It's off the beaten path and a little rough. Even in my book, I found a really cool old book in Havana when I was shopping one day, and I brought it home, and I ended up using it in my book. Some references in it to Regla in the 1800s, when they were saying how it used to be really nice when the pirates hung out here and spent their money, but now it's just not the nicest place to go. But the church is located right out here, and you can see that with this virgin being represented as such, a lot of enslaved people were baptized here. Indigenous people were baptized here, including the Spanish Seminole children that were brought here. And today, this is actually a sacred site for practitioners of Santeria. This is Yemaya, the goddess representation of Yemaya, the goddess of the sea, in the Yoruba Santeria faith. So here's actually the baptism record for Rita Montes de Oca. You can see here that her mother, Rita Magauga, was from the pueblo of Choconicla up here as well. It said she was actually born in Choconicla. The Apalachee were near the Apalachee province. So it's not really referring to the Apalachee people, who by this time were not politically extant as a group. Excuse me. And so this was referring to the province within Florida of Apalachee. And then Gregorio Montes de Oca, who was the brother of my ancestor, he may have been his father. We don't know for sure, but they appear to have been brothers. Was listed here as well. Their other child, you can see here that it actually says India, referring to her race, and that she was actually born on Sanibel. So this is one of the first recorded documented births on Sanibel, the pueblo de Sanibel, and her father being Gregorio and her mother being Rita, listed right here, Rita Magauga. And my friends who speak the Ilapongi and Istijati languages, they couldn't figure out what Magauga means. Maybe we'll figure that out one day, if that's a name in the language or not. And she was also from Choconicla in the Panhandle. So a little bit about those baptisms. Out of 42 parents, out of all those children, 5 fathers were listed as Indian. 16 were Hispanic Latino, and several of them were actually native. A number of them were Campechanos. They were actually Maya people who were, after the Maya rebelled against the Spanish colonization, they took a lot of them away and enslaved them or put them in servitude in Cuba. And so these men were Campechanos. They were Maya men, and they were staying in the ranchos, and they married indigenous women in the ranchos. Incredibly interesting story there. So 4 fathers were Maya. 3 fathers were actually from Spain. Out of all of them, only 3. 1 Cuban, which was my great whatever uncle or grandfather, who knows. And then 6 children had no father listed at all, which points to the indigenous culture of matrilineal descent and matriarchy of families, because you don't inherit your lineage through your father; it's through your mother. And then 16 of the 30 children had a surname. 14 of them just said Indian. They did not have a surname; it just said Indian after their name. So a lot of the descendants of these people, they may be in Oklahoma, or they may be among the Seminole or Miccosukee people in Florida today. These are some of the records that you can see in the book. I have a number of tables that include statistics. I have a section that talks about the history of each of these towns that is listed within those baptism records. And you can see a general migration here. They were in the Panhandle, largely among the Apalachicola towns. And they migrated down the coast after the Americans, Andrew Jackson invading, crossing into Spanish Florida illegally, burning Seminole towns, Miccosukee town specifically. That prompted a lot of them to move south into the peninsula, and settlers from Georgia and South Carolina moving down, taking land and kicking people out. They moved down to survive. So here's an early family tree of the Montes de Ocas. You see some question marks here because I contacted the diocese in Matanza and Havana, Cuba. I received letters from them. There are no records anywhere to be found. I've searched through baptism records myself, hours and days upon days of just going through the records, looking for other members of my family or other Spanish Seminole families. I think we found all that we could in the books that are available. But you have Gregorio here. He's old enough to be Juan, my ancestor. He's old enough to be his dad. But it's indicated that he may have been his brother by the evidence. And Juan, my ancestor, had 2 wives. His first wife, they were both Seminole. And his first wife, I think, was removed. This happened quite a bit, where families were broken up and they were sent out to Indian territory on the Seminole Trail of Tears. And he had a couple of children, at least 2 children with his first wife, including Victoria, who's really interesting. She married one of the first mayors of Tampa, Alfonso Delaney. He was actually French, I believe. And Crusette, as she went by, she stayed there in Tampa Bay and lived her life in Tampa Bay. She was the daughter of his first wife and him, and she was born at sea. Some of these children in the baptisms were born at sea, which is really interesting, on the way down, or they were born, one of them says, born in Regla on a trip down there. And then his second wife, Mary, is my ancestor. And I'm descended from his son, Manuel, who went by the name Canoe. And then there are a number of Montes de Oca family members in the ranchos whose parents we don't know. There was a John Montes de Oca documented as Indian, Gavino, Dominga. She may have been a sibling, a cousin, or a child of Gregorio or Juan. She married Maximo Hernandez, and he was actually really interesting figure. He was one of the first documented landowners after the U.S. took over Florida and started to place land under some of the original inhabitants, being the Spanish Seminole and the Latin men. And if you're crossing over the Skyway Bridge going across from St. Petersburg, the point there is Maximo Park, and there's Maximo Point, and that little jot of land that comes out is named after him. But there was a man named Dr. Ben Strobel, or Benjamin Strobel, who came down to Sanibel Island in 1833, and he documented the rancho there when my family was there. We know they were there from the baptism records. These were the years that the Montes de Oca children were being baptized, and they were living on Sanibel. And he noted that by far the largest number of people there were Indians, according to him. They were employed by the Spaniards. They went out in large canoes, and they had gardens. You know, they retained that tradition from the Muskogean people that they were part of. I think by pumpkins here, he might also mean like squash, because corn, beans, and squash we call the Three Sisters. They're traditional foods of ours. They also grew sugarcane, which was from Asia originally, I believe. And so he also followed them, or went across on their canoes one night across the bay to Punta Rasa, and he observed some of their dances, and they did stomp dances, and the women were wearing their turtle shell shakers. They had them on their legs, and he talked about how the sound was so loud it was deafening. But he described the dance, and these are dances we still do today. And one thing that's really interesting is we have in our community, the Tuscarora Nation, and among other Haudenosaunee people, we have a dance called the alligator dance. That our oral history and the story around this dance is that it was given to us by the Seminole, but it's actually a Miccosukee dance. I ended up finding out that it was a Miccosukee dance, and the Miccosukee version, at least the one that was recorded by the Smithsonian of Josie Billy back in maybe the 1940s or 50s, it's the exact same song that we sing. And I shouldn't be shocked, because our oral history is usually pretty accurate. But it was just really cool as someone who's descended from people who were recording doing these dances. I've got a little video here of some of my cousins that are on this call and myself last year at our annual powwow doing the alligator dance, and this is what it looks like. So you can see it's actually a really fun dance, and when you really get going, sometimes when you spin around, it's kind of fun to like spin so fast that your partner's legs come off the ground. And the story that we carry from this dance is that the male partner in the dance is the head of the alligator, and the woman partner is the tail of the alligator. And so when kind of like the way an alligator does a death roll, when they grab onto their prey, they spin, and that's what the spinning represents. But that's our story about it. So the ranchos in 1836 were evacuated. I highly doubt that they were fully evacuated, because there were other documented instances of the Spanish Seminoles still being in the ranchos. But the people recorded, the Americans recorded that they were fully evacuated. This was after a Seminole resistance fighter and his men. He was recorded with the name Waihoki. He only really appears here in the documentation, but there may be people who have heard of him otherwise. Attacked Yusepa Island, but he didn't attack the Seminole people there. He attacked the American officer who was posted there. And this officer, his name was Henry Cruz. He was harassing the Spanish Seminole quite extensively. They were trying to collect taxes on the fish that they were catching and shipping down to Cuba. They wanted to, get whatever kind of money out of this operation that they could. They wanted to shut it down. Henry Cruz was incredibly racist, the things that he would say about the people living in these ranchos. And he was actually disciplined for the way he was treating the people there in the ranchos. They complained to Fort Brooke, and he was disciplined for that. But unfortunately, when they fled Southwest Florida, they ended up right in the epicenter of Seminole removals. This is right out of Tampa Bay, originally right out of Fort Brooke here. Seminole people were rounded up and imprisoned within the fort. Lots of people, they're very harrowing stories, and some are included in my book of people who escaped from the the Trail of Tears that they would be sent on. And then later on, out here on Egmont Key, this was a very dark place where later in the Seminole War, and I say war singularly, it was one long war. The Americans saw it as three, but for the Seminole people resisting, it was one long war. They were shipped out of these places and imprisoned and abused in some pretty bad ways. But you can see here there was a rancho at Shaw's Point. Some villages. McQueen, who's known from the Battle at Horseshoe Bend, moved down with his people, moved his town down, Tallapoosa. And my own family, when they moved here, they were documented here at Spanish Town Creek. And my ancestor Juan himself, as well as Gregorio, were listed in the will of the Hispanic-Latino original proprietor of Spanish Town Creek. And my ancestor ended up being imprisoned with Mary, my other ancestor, and their children, including my ancestor Manuel. They were imprisoned for years at Fort Brooke after they were captured. So here we have the islands out, the Mullet Keys out here. And here you see they're listed. This was actually where my family lived, right here at Spanish Town Creek, which is now a very upscale neighborhood in Tampa, Hyde Park. But they're listed here as friendly Indians right across from Fort Brooke. So General Jessup, who was instrumental in the war, was really determined to round up the Seminole Spanish Seminole people, remove them. He argued that they were supplying arms to the resistance, that whether or not they lived on the reservation didn't matter. And he said that all Indian women settled at the rancho or on the coast, and their families, whether of mixed blood or not, were to be removed. And one of the chiefs, his name was Holate Masla, he actually claimed the community that there at Spanish Town Creek as his own people. And so that's another interesting piece of it. But the removals, they were rounded up, and there were at least 150 Spanish Indians that were removed from the ranchos in the barrier islands, and including probably relatives of my ancestor. And this is one account. It basically says that they were Spaniards and Indians that had intermarried with the Seminole. As a body, really just the horrible condition they were in after they were rounded up and put on these boats. This was an observation of them as they passed through New Orleans. They'd be brought by boat across the Gulf and up the Mississippi, and then they would have to march all the way out to Oklahoma from the Mississippi, just talking about how deplorable the conditions were. So Juan, Gregorio, and a number of the other men that were listed, in some of them in these baptism records as well, filed a petition. And they didn't file it themselves. I don't think any of them could read or write, at least in English. And they had a couple of white American proprietors that sort of sponsored them because they were their labor. They were making money off of these ranchos and the fishing operations. So they sponsored them and wrote this petition to try to get them permission to stay. And you can see here that, they talked about those baptisms. They talked about marrying Seminole women and that these marriages were recognized. They offered to remain at Fort Brooke, as my family did for years afterward, and pledged their allegiance to the United States, really just as traitors to the Seminole resistance at that point. because like my ancestor himself working as a translator, he was at times he protested and he refused to serve as a translator. Like after the reservation was reduced, there were records saying that, Juan Montes de Oca is, belligerent and refusing to work with us. But that only happened after, mistreatment of Seminole people continued, or he was upset about things. So he worked as a translator in the Ilapongi and the Muskogee Apanaga languages. He was the brother of Marcelina and Gregorio. We don't know how he was related to him, but they were always together in records. And it looks like perhaps Mary, my ancestor, was from the Johns family, because Manuel, their son, my ancestor, and their other sons, like Johnny, used the last name Johns, and they lived near the Brighton Reservation after they moved inland. And that is a name on the Brighton Reservation. So that could be a connection. Not sure about that. He worked with other Seminole people that would work as guides, and he would translate for them. And then his children stayed in the area. This is actually Fred Montes de Oca. The name was anglicized to Montes de Oca. So my family members now with that last name, they go by Montes de Oca. And so this is Fred here working with, I can't remember who this is, but in the 1950s, he helped the Seminole tribe of Florida to take their cattle operations that they had going back to, when the Spanish first came and brought cows. They were being raised by Seminole people, and helped turn it into a major operation for the Seminole tribe and a source of income. A number of families also moved down. Mixed blood families from the Carolinas moved down and married in to these mixed blood Spanish Seminole people. And that's talked about a little bit in the book. And they remained really close with Seminole people. And there are a number of stories of them hiding Tallahassee. Here's Chief Tallahassee in a restored, colored restored picture. And stories of my own ancestor, whose name was Tallahassee Stokes, was named by Chief Tallahassee. And I found an article with an interview by Chief Tallahassee. This is an old story passed down in my family about my granddad, who's on this. His grandfather was Tallahassee Stokes, and he was actually named by Chief Tallahassee, who used to stay with my family when they lived near in Central Florida, near Fort Meade, and had cattle industry there. And I found an interview with Chief Tallahassee where he actually talked about this story and naming the baby and putting taking some beads off of one of the women he was with off of her neck and putting it on the child. And that was actually the chief's own words, which was really cool to find that. But what happened to the Spanish Seminole? We know that literally hundreds, at least 150, were removed to Indian territory. A lot of Seminole people in Oklahoma that I've talked to say that they have stories in their family that they have Spanish ancestry. There are a number of borrow words in the Seminole language that come from Spanish, which is cool. And of course, the people living today are the living descendants of the Spanish Seminole people among the Miccosukee and Seminole and independent Seminole communities in Florida. And that is the end of my talk. I crammed it into an hour.
I'm very grateful for you sharing all of that knowledge with us. And I'm very thankful to everyone who joined us today. This virtual Cafecito lecture is part of our, ongoing celebration because March is Florida Archaeology Month. And so we're trying to do this virtual Cafecito lectures every other month. But again, thank you so much, everybody. This talk will be on our YouTube. So if you want to learn more about who we are, my name is Natalie de la Torre Salas, and I am a public archaeologist in Southwest Florida. So if any of you have further questions about archaeology in the region or Florida archaeology, you can check out the comment section. I put the website for our FPAN. and for the Florida Archaeology Month events. I know this is the last week of the month, but there are still a couple of events going statewide, so check it out. And if you have any other questions for David, you can follow him on this Spanish Seminole. That's the Instagram. And I think also on Facebook. And I'm sure David will also, share his contact information with you guys on the comment section. And if you haven't done so already, please read the Spanish Seminole. So thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Nat. Thanks everybody for having me.